Superfund is another name for the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act. The law was designed to clean up hazardous and abandoned waste sites. The Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry provides cleanup of hazardous substances that may endanger public health or safety. Generally, the removal actions that CERCLA authorizes are short-term response actions. The removal actions are classified as an emergency, time-critical, and non-time critical. Removal responses are usually addressing localized risks, such as abandoned drums that contain hazardous substances. These substances could contaminate soil, which poses as an acute risk to human health as well as the environment. Remedial actions are the long-term actions to remove contamination. Remedial actions permanently as well as significantly reduce risks that are involved with hazardous substances. Remedial actions usually are involved in non-time critical situations. The migration of pollutants are maintained as well as neutralizing the toxic substances. There are 4 classes that are termed the potential responsible parties that could be liable for the contamination at a Superfund site. The current owner or operator of the site, the owner or operator at the time of the contamination occurred, a person who arranged for the disposal of the substance at the site, and the person who transported the hazardous substance. Before a Superfund site can start to be cleaned up, the EPA has to inspect the site. The inspection involves records, reviews, interviews, and has a limited field sampling. After the inspection, the EPA develops a hazard ranking system score to determine the status of the site. Sites have to have a high enough score to qualify for the remedial investigation/feasibility study. This is an extensive sampling of the site, and there is an assessment to determine severity of the contamination and the risks. The study provides information to develop alternatives for remediation cleanup. A proposed plan is presented for a public review and comment. When an alternative is approved, the site enters a remedial design phase, then onto the remedial action phase. Many Superfund sites have long-term monitoring and then 5-year reviews after the remedial actions have been completed. In 1999, the property of the Eastland Woolen Mill was contaminated due to mill operations. Also, some of the contamination migrated downstream. The mill was a 250,000 square foot building, and there were 2 dams and several outbuildings. The 2 dams created a mill pond. The original parts of the mill were constructed in the late 1800s or early 1900s. The Eastland Woolen Mill was owned and operated from 1936 to 1999 when the mill closed. The mill had been using a dye-aid chemical to dye wool, which contained chlorobenzene. The mill used similar chemicals to chlorobenzene, which in the process of wool production, wastewater was discharged. The wastewater was contaminated with chemicals which flowed into the east branch of the Sebasticook River, which flowed under the mill. In 1983, the drinking water wells along Main Street were found to have been contaminated with mainly chlorobenzene. When an employee from MEDEP visited Gallison's, a restaurant in Corinna, they found that the water had a peculiar smell and taste. After the water was sampled and tested, the water was contaminated by chlorobenzene, and the amount of contamination was above the maximum contaminant levels. The town of Corinna did not have any public water system until 1995, so most residents had to rely on private water wells. In 1995, the Corinna Water District began supplying water to customers. The mill closed and was sold in 1996, and in 1997, the town of Corinna got the property as compensation for taxes owed. In 1996, while the water district was installing a pipe across the river downstream from the mill, they found contamination. Eastland got a sediment sampling, and in 1997, MEDEP collected additional samples. There were samples that were analyzed on site, and it was found that over 1,000 feet downstream was contaminated by the Eastland Woolen Mill. MEDEP collected samples of surface water and sediment samples in 1998 and found that 1,900 feet downstream had elevated contamination levels. There were 3 sources that were identified for the cause of contamination. The first was from the dye kettles that were in the wet process area of the mill. The wool dyeing process had waste that was discharged into the river, and onto the ground that was under the mill. The second was the soil that was found near the former underground storage tank. The chlorobenzene was stored in a 7,600-gallon underground storage tank. The third was chemicals that were removed during a state emergency removal after the mill was closed and abandoned with hazardous chemicals still on the premises. Contamination from the site affects groundwater and surface water. There were 17 groundwater wells that had contamination. There were originally 11 wells that were impacted by the releases. The river was contaminated, supported fisheries, wetlands, as well as sensitive environments.